the clouds. Okay. And you should all be seeing those. I hope it went through okay. And it'll ask you if it's okay to be recorded. And so we will have this treasure of a talk on Wyndham for our hard science fiction channel. That I believe that's the correct name on YouTube. And I can put their link when I get around to it later as well. I want to welcome our two speakers who are experts on John Wyndham. And he had a very crucial role to play. I think I need to raise my seat. I'm a little low here. Sorry. He had a very crucial role to play during the whole Cold War era. And that had a huge impact on many forms of science fiction. It sort of percolated through all of science fiction. So I will introduce them in turn. Oh, I have to keep admitting people, I'm sorry. I will first introduce Patricia McManus, who I know because she did an essay for a collection that I put together for Routledge, the Routledge Companion to Literature and Class. And she is also a very eminent professor of literature and has taught, I believe, at Brighton. If I get the colleges wrong, just correct me, at Brighton University. And I think you're currently in Oman at a university there. Am I correct on all that? And you have awards, you have published credits, and if you want to add any of those in the chat or want me to hunt them down, I can do that. I'm just a little scattered this morning. But Patricia is very eminent in the field, recognized in the field of studies of utopia, dystopian, futurology, science fiction, and other. She's very involved with the whole political economic context, right, of science fiction. Is that a correct? Is okay. So then I will move on to our other host, who I know from many dimensions, Phil Nichols. He is the technical wizard on our spin-off group, which is the Planet Zoom Players, currently working on RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots by Karel Čapek. And he's doing a great job on that. So that's one of his incarnations. The other is that he's a great scholar and has done dissertation work on John Wyndham. I didn't know this about you, Bill. You're so modest. Anyway, so he's got that credential, although he teaches film and digital media at Wolverhampton University. Is that the correct one? Okay. And is a well-renowned and very popular, very well-liked professor there. I know you are because I just know how you relate to people. So he also has many credits to his name. You see that sign behind him, Bradbury 100. I think he's one of the top, if not the top, Bradbury podcaster. So those of you who are also into Ray Bradbury, you might want to look up that. Wow. And so I'm going to conclude by asking people, we will have a chat later where you can all introduce yourselves, but for now, as we're going into the program portion, please turn off mute your microphones. I'm stumbling around a lot this morning. Please mute your microphones. And with that, I think I will first just ask Patricia to start. I'm doing the old-fashioned ladies first. I'm sorry, it's just a habit. And you may wish to make like a, I don't know, 5-10 minute statement about your life and how you got around interested in John Wyndham. So I will turn it over to Patricia first.
Hey, thank you, Gloria. And hi, Phil. It's nice to meet you. But I should correct, just in case of the misperception. Phil is the expert on John Wyndham. I'm not. I just like to read him. I've never written on him. But I'm very intrigued by the period immediately after the Second World War in English letters, and in particular how class gets rearticulated. And that overlaps with a more recent interest I have in dystopian fiction. So would it be okay, Gloria, if I have a short presentation, because what I wanted to do was kind of open up a question and then Phil can run with it or not, if he thinks it might be interesting. But the question was, why didn't John Wyndham write dystopian fiction? I thought it might be a...
Go for it.
I thought it might be it might be a useful one. It might not. If not, we can kick it to the curb. But so I'll speak, it'll be about 10 minutes. I'll probably speak too fast. So if anybody wants me to slow down, just feel free to shout. But what I wanted to do was just look for a moment at the futures we find in John Wyndham's fiction. And what's important here, it's not the vision of the future these stories enable or project, but the vision of the present, which makes such a future plausible or possible. Now, if we step back from Wyndham for a moment and just think about some of the popular dystopian fictions, because in dystopian fictions, the present that is available in the text, the present that's implicit in the text, is one which is fatally flawed in some way and which is just as fatally blind to its own flaws. So in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, for example, this is a fiction which castigates the taste for convenience, leisure, and ease of Huxley's own interwar generation, the generation which dominated his present. It castigates, too, the technological fantasies of a world without labor, a world without pain, or a world without emotional suffering that Huxley believed lay in the risings of Fabian's fictional and non-fictional. If we move forward a little bit, in 1984, George Orwell, he targets the organized lying of decades of imperial wars and then the organized lying of the total war of the repoliticized forces of World War II. Likewise, he targets the deformation of language and perception and belief he had witnessed both in Britain and in Spain in the 1930s. And he saw these as turbocharging what then became his vision of a future without truth, without sincerity, or without privacy. Now, if we zoom back into the futures present in John Wyndham's fiction and look at their roots in his present, the present, both implicit and explicit in his science fiction novels, is not a terrible one, nor is it ripe with any forthcoming terror. In The Day of the Triffids, for example, Bill is quite happy in his life, or if happy is too strong a term for Wyndham's measured, cautious, middle-class professionals, then we could say that Bill is content. The small, odd scene early on in the novel, in which he congratulates himself on having a private room in the hospital, this introduces class differences, not as any standardized sense of superiority, but rather as a matter of expected comfort, convenience, and ease. His private room saves him from the indignities of a public ward. Now, I'm not going to fill in any more detail there about the way in which Wyndham's novels, or the future in Wyndham's novels, drag with them a sense of his present. I want to just, for a moment, and please, I hope you'll have patience with me, I want to just open up a small theoretical moment from Frederick Jameson about the importance of thinking of science fiction or speculative fiction, any fiction focused on the future. Jameson argued strongly that we need to think of it in terms of how those fictions articulate the past. And there's a beautiful passage in his essay, Progress versus Utopia, or Can We Imagine the Future? There's a beautiful passage there in which he wrote, and I quote, science fiction is not there to give us images of the future, whatever such images might mean for a reader who will necessarily predecease their materialization. But it is rather to defamiliarize and restructure our experience of our own present, and to do so in specific ways distinct from all other forms of defamiliarization. The present in this society, he's talking about his own society of the 1970s there, the present in this society and in the physical and psychic dissociation of the human subjects who inhabit it is inaccessible directly, is numb, habituated, empty of effect. Elaborate strategies of indirection are therefore necessary if we're to somehow break through our monadic insulation and to experience for some first and real time this present, which is, after all we have. So end quotation there. So what I want to do is just ask you to hold that in the back of your minds and then to indulge me while we have a look at Wyndham's the bones, the bare bones of the present in Wyndham's fiction. So I want to go back again to The Day of the Triffids, a novel I think that is very caught in its own contemporary moment. And in the novel, our narrator, Bill, he uses his second chapter to tell of us his early life, because he says he wishes to bring us back before the blindness which had overcome the world. He tells us that he did not become an accountant like his suburban father. And he tells us further that his father was a man who had divided the world sharply into two types of men: desk men who work with their brains, and non-desk men who didn't and who got dirty. This is a view, Bill says, that by the time his father held it was almost a century out of date. But what replaces it? Bill does not become an accountant. He becomes a scientist working for a commercial exploiter of the Triffid oil. This, compared to the life of an accountant his father had held out, makes him comfortable. The world, for Bill, is okay. Now, whether thought of in terms of the articulation of Cold War anxieties or of more local British concerns about the displacement of a professional middle class by the expanding middle class of the new professions, including the entry of women in some numbers into these professions, there is little in the way of overt or urgent anxiety or pain articulated in the text about Bill's present. The narrator indeed tells us, when he's reflecting on possible causes for the Triffids, he tells us that most people do not think of the sudden occurrence of the Triffids, and I quote, as a kind of sample visitation, harbingers of worse to come if the world did not mend its ways and behave its troublesome self. Now, troublesome self, as it's used there, it's a glib contempt, a light-hearted, but still a contempt for precisely the type of ideological or political work the dystopia was thought to do, to act as a warning, to act, as it said in the novel, as a kind of sample visitation, harbingers of worse to come if the world did not mend its ways. This is something that The Day of the Triffids explicitly rules out for itself, rules out for its reader as a way of reading itself. Now, to finish, I just want to bring you to one short story that I have seen referred to by scholars as a dystopian story. We can argue with, about how that's defined, but I think it's an interesting one. The story is called Consider Her Ways. It was published in 1956. It's a long short story or novella, and it involves the description of a future world which is experienced by an individual inhabitant as entirely oppressive, and is experienced by nobody else in that future world as not oppressive at all, but rather inevitable and good. Now, in the novel, the present contains a scientist, a biologist called Dr. Perrigan. He has been experimenting with viruses as a way of trying to breed out the troublesome brown rats. But as a result, a virus of his mutated, was released, it attacked male humans and resulted in their extermination. These are the ingenious biological meddlings, I think, that Wyndham liked to scatter in his work. Now, the surviving women in this society, they suffer chaos for some time until they regroup and form a new society. In this new society, children are born, but only girl children survive. Our narrator is a woman whose life is split between the novella's future, where she is a mother with a capital M, that's her function, and her own memories of her life in the present of the novel's composition and readership, in other words, the mid-1950s. Using a first-person narrative frame, the narrative opens with the narrator floating up from some nameless, formless void. Our narrator is bewildered, confused, terrified. She doesn't know where she is or what's happening to her. When she starts to get a realization of where she is, the first very, very strong sense of where she is and how she is and who she is a very visceral revulsion at her own size. She's very, very overweight. When she realizes this, she faints. When she comes to, she is slowly brought to a fuller realization of the world she is in. And she insists to herself, for the majority of the story, that she must be having a dream, or what she calls in the text a projection. She finds out or discovers that she's a member of a regimented female-only society in which, rather than being her slim and young and childless self, she's a mother whose regimented life is to produce 3 children or 4 children at a time. She's expected as one of the caste of mothers to be uneducated and incurious, rather than the medical doctor she is in her own life. She is served by a caste of small women called servitors. The manual work is done by female labourers, and the whole is ruled over by the doctorate. And the doctorate is the name in the text for a layer of educated women, amongst whom doctors of medicine predominate. This is a future modelled on the ant's nest. Reproduction, not progress, is the purpose. Like ants, these women and their organisation into these 4 layers of society. The 4 layers, they're each one of them symbiotically helps to reproduce the other. So we have the servitors, the workers, the mothers, and then at the top we have the doctorate. Now, this world, a world in which our narrator experiences it as horrific and horrifying, it implies a present in which Wyndham arguably saw some tendrils or harbingers of a type of feminism gone awry, where women would imagine that they could live separately from men. But there's no echo, there's no whisper, there's no subtext, there's no hint of this in the story at all. Rather, the critique of the present goes along the lines of a very common critique of mass society in the post-war years. It's a world in which female emancipation was achieved in the early part of the 20th century, but was squandered in an elaborate system of mass persuasion pursued by commercial interests. So I'll just give you a quotation from the text. At the beginning of the 20th century, women were starting to have their chance to lead useful, creative, interesting lives. But that did not suit commerce. It needed them much more as mass consumers than as producers, except in the most routine levels. So romance was adopted and developed as a weapon against their further progress and to promote consumption, and it was used intensively. Women must never for a moment be allowed to forget their sex and compete as equals. Everything had to have a feminine angle. So the argument here seems to be that the glorification of romance and of the consumption that went with the glorification of romance, something that was an intrinsic tendency of women, both to idealize romantic relationships and also to want to baptize them with consumption, with interior decor in homes. That there was, this went too far, there was a backlash against us, and when the virus eliminated all males, this backlash resulted in this very regimented society of women. So I'm going to leave it there because that's the only fully articulated, is it to say critique of the present is too strong, but a fully articulated understanding of where this terrible new world has come from in relation to the world Wyndham was writing about. And what's interesting to me in it, and I think what sheds light on his non-dystopian fiction, is the way in which the working class women and men must be invisible. There is no question of, the 60 to 70% of English women who both before and after World War II didn't have a choice to give up work. And I think it's part of the political economy of Wyndham's novels that they can only really function when it's the world of the middle classes and a very specific professional middle class, a world in which the new professions of the 20th century, the scientists, the journalists, the medical doctors, it's one in which they dominate. And it's an interesting question to me as to why that should be so. If we think of a lot of other science fiction, the masses, the working classes, usually there is some role for them to play. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia, and I appreciate especially your working class references because that ties in also with RUR and some of the issues going on in our play production, I believe, unless Phil can correct me if it doesn't. Anyway, no, that's an important insight. So now I will turn it over to Phil and he can make some kind of an opening. Just how did you get involved with Wyndham? What made it interesting?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. I will turn to your question about dystopia in a minute. I'm still thinking about it because there are a lot of works of Wyndham. There's maybe only 5 major novels, but there are lots of short stories. And I'm racking my brain and I'm trying to think of exceptions, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. But I'll come back to that in a moment. To address Gloria's question of how I came to Wyndham, there's 2 ways that I came to Wyndham. First is, I think every British school child of my generation encountered John Wyndham either through books they were given at school, and it's usually The Day of the Triffids, or through the many TV and film adaptations of his work. He is probably the most adapted author of all in the UK in terms of television, radio, and film. Probably beaten by H.G. Wells, but that's about all in terms of British authors whose science fiction works have been adapted for media. So he was sort of always there in my childhood. More specifically, how I became interested in Wyndham is through my interest in media and my obsession really with watching films and then trying to seek out what we would normally call the source material. So I'm very interested in writers who seem to be particularly well suited for adaptation for TV and film. So that includes Wyndham, it includes Ray Bradbury, it includes H.G. Wells and various other writers. And I'm particularly interested in authors who actually write for the visual media. So again, Bradbury, people like Harlan Ellison, who also wrote extensively for TV as well as being a short story writer, Richard Matheson, and various others. I wonder if it might be a good idea to just draw attention to Wyndham's major works for the benefit of any who haven't seen a bibliography recently. I don't know if that's terribly clear on the screen. This is
I can read it.
Good.
Only my name is there.
This is a kind of an omnibus
Gloria.
volume.
So she's
I can hear a voice.
harassing me.
I can hear somebody else's voice. Sorry. So this is an omnibus volume that contains Wyndham's major novels. So we've got The Day of the Triffids, and then The Kraken Wakes, The Chrysalids, The Seeds of Time is a short story collection, and then Trouble with Lichin and The Midwich Cuckoos. So those are his major novels and one short story collection in there. This is a fantastic book, by the way. I've had this since the 80s. It's very heavy. Wyndham's career distinctly divides into 2 halves. There's the pre-war career. He was born in 1903, and he spent his early 20s writing extensively for American pulp magazines. So he was always interested in H.G. Wells' style of storytelling. And his earliest writings really were very much in the Wellesian vogue. And he, at some point, I think in about 1931, he happened across an American pulp magazine, which was Air Wonder Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsback. And that's how he became interested in American science fiction. And he tried his hand at writing for them. So he sent stories in and sold them. So he made quite a living from this before World War II. World War II was a major disruption to his life because obviously it disturbed everyone. He lived in the heart of London. So he was right there during the Blitz. It stopped him writing. He worked in the censorship department of the Ministry of Information, or whatever the government department was called at that time. And towards the end of the war, he was called up for national service, joined the army, became a lance corporal in the Signal Corps. And in 1944, he was sent to Normandy as part of the Normandy landings. So, you can imagine how disruptive that would be to anyone's life and career. He was separated during the war from his life partner, Grace Wilson, who he'd been living with for maybe 10 years at that point. So they were separated for most of the war. And when he came back from the war, Wyndham's own brother, Vivian Bainham Harris, was just establishing a career as a novelist. And it gave Wyndham the idea that he could do that as well. He'd been mainly writing short stories before the Second World War, and now he decides, I can become a novelist. And this is really where this second half of his career comes along. And he changed his writing name. In professional life and personal life, he was always known as John Bainham Harris. Bainham Harris was his father's surname. So he was John Bainham Harris. But his full name, for anyone who doesn't know, and I always have to have this written down, so bear with me, his full name, John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bainham Harris. So he was mostly known as John Bainham Harris, and his pre-war fiction was published under the name of John Bainham or John Bainham Harris or John B. Harris, variations on that. But he wanted to make a clear separation from that after World War II. So he settled on the name of John Wyndham. So that's his first name and one of his middle names. And he sort of took on this new identity. And he was now writing for mainstream book publication. And he worked out this form of science fiction that he thought would be acceptable to the mainstream. And what he specifically tried to avoid was space opera. He specifically tried to avoid writing stories that were not set in the real world that he lived in. And he talked about this in terms of being the limits of a story. He always tried to identify the limits in terms of what would be acceptable. And an example of where he made a conscious choice on this is with his novel, The Midwich Cuckoos, which is about a small village where what we assume to be an alien presence comes down to this small English village and impregnates all of the women in the village. So, and they have this kind of forced motherhood. The children are presented as being, the children that result from this are presented as being telepathic, maybe some kind of hive mind, and apparently very controlling and trying to think of the right word. They definitely want to have things their way. And in doing this, Wyndham thought about how he could have presented these children as physically monstrous, but he decided, no, that would be going too far. So he just gave them glowing eyes. And if you've ever seen any of the film versions of The Midwich Cuckoos, which Village of the Damned was the first one. There was also a film called Children of the Damned and a remake of Village of the Damned. And eventually there was a TV miniseries called The Midwich Cuckoos, resuming the original title of the novel. Wyndham just has these golden eyes, is about the limit of the monstrousness, the physical monstrousness of these characters, because he decides to set limits on himself based on sort of what's realistic and what's acceptable. And the type of science fiction that he favored is, he talked about science fiction that was implicatory. So he was always interested in setting out a premise and then saying, okay, what happens next? If this is the premise of the story, what is the consequence of the story? And it so happened that those major novels that were published after World War II are all, or nearly all, catastrophic novels, catastrophic situations. So The Day of the Triffids, these plants take over, intelligent ambulatory plants take over because there's been some sort of meteor thing in the sky that has blinded all of the human population of Earth. In The Kraken Wakes, some strange things fall out of the sky and take over the seas. So we have this sort of strange invasion, which comes both from outer space and from under the sea simultaneously. And trouble with lichen is one of the exceptions to this. The chrysalids is one of the exceptions to this. But the Midwich Cuckoos is also this supposed alien invasion takeover that descends on a small village. So all of these are presented as catastrophic. Now, I think this now brings us to this question of the dystopia, because the nature of a catastrophe story is that something unexpected happens. And usually with those stories, your characters are either going to succumb to the catastrophe or they're going to overcome the catastrophe. And in, I think, all of Wyndham's catastrophe stories, there is a sense of overcoming, or at least a sense of the characters prevailing, but it is in a world which is forever changed. So, for example, at the end of the Day of the Triffids, a new sort of equilibrium is reached between the humans and these ambulatory plants, but it's a very uneasy rebalancing. And it basically comes from the humans isolating themselves from the landmass where the plants are. So you leave that novel thinking, well, this is probably only a temporary rebalance, and eventually those plants are going to invade the island as well, where the humans have gathered. So Wyndham tends to present these unexpected catastrophes and then shows his characters overcoming this. If you look at Amy Binns's book, which Gloria mentioned earlier, it's called Hidden Wyndham. And in there are 3 or 4 chapters that talk about what Wyndham did during wartime. And there's some very moving letters that he sent to his life partner. And, well, he presumably received letters back as well, but I think only the letters he wrote are referred to or quoted in Amy Binns's book. But there's some really fascinating demonstrations of how World War II totally affected Wyndham, even before he was sent to the Normandy landings, even before he was working in the censorship department. The whole being disrupted by the war, by the fact that all the women and children in London were evacuated during the war. His partner, Grace, was sent first to the South Coast, then she was sent to Wales. She was a teacher, so she was sent with her group of pupils, students, to these various places to carry on her teaching. Meanwhile, Wyndham, working for the censorship department, is stuck in London. So there's this enormous wrenching effect of the two being separated forcefully, and then having to cope with both having different careers that were requiring them to be in different places. And then, of course, fortunately, they're able to come back together again. There is a happy ending. They do get married quite late in Wyndham's life, because he didn't believe in marriage. He didn't believe in what's the word? These sort of these rituals, these conventions of life. He believed in if people wanted to be together, they lived together. But he did eventually decide that getting married was the right thing to do, which he did, I think, when he was about 60 years old. So he and Grace did marry in the end. So I think Wyndham's personal circumstances really do inform all of these works. The one work that I think may be dystopian is The Chrysalids. This is unusually for Wyndham, not set in the present day. It's set as a post-apocalyptic story. It's set in Canada after some unspecified apocalypse, but we can assume it's a nuclear war because there are mutations popping up all over the place. And the remainder of civilization that we're allowed to see within the novel is a very repressive civilization, a religion-based civilization that does not allow people to be any different to a certain predefined norm. And the narrator of the story starts off really as a child and then grows during this. And he either has some mutation or he befriends people who have mutations, and they eventually have to flee from the civilization. And it turns out that they have telepathic powers. and they're able to communicate over vast distances with similar mutated children in other parts of the world. Now, that could be a dystopia because it has this sort of negatively portrayed civilization. But when I think about it, what Wyndham nearly always does in nearly all of his novels, nearly all of his short stories, he writes from the point of view of a character in the story. He very rarely writes objectively. Very rarely is there an omniscient narrator. It's nearly always that somebody within the story is the narrator. So what we know about the world is what they know about the world, and what they know about the world is limited because they're limited by their own senses, what they see and hear and witness. And so the Chrysalids may be a dystopia, but because it's told from the point of view of a character suffering from the dystopia and who doesn't have any special privileged knowledge of how that society runs or is established, our knowledge of that society is limited. So it doesn't quite critique that society in the way that, say, Aldous Huxley does in Brave New Worlds, or Orwell does in 1984. It never kind of steps back and gives us the bigger picture. We're always within the story. And I think that is the strength of Wyndham's storytelling. It makes his stories incredibly intimate, I think. Even when he's talking about these global catastrophes, we always feel very close to a small number of characters, and usually one character who is the narrator. So I think I should stop there, but I think that comment about dystopias is part of why I like Wyndham. You know, if there were things about Wyndham that I didn't enjoy, then I would stay away from Wyndham. But it is those very methods of composition that he favors that I think makes his work really strong and really powerful. And I think The Chrysalids actually is a novel which reads very much of today. It's a little bit dated, not as dated as some of his other novels, but I think it really reads, I read it only a few weeks ago, and it reads very much like a young adult science fiction novel of today. And I think with a sensible publisher giving it the right push, it could be a bestseller all over again, really. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, now we have quite a number of themes and things that sort of overlap between the two speakers, which I was wondering where they would overlap, but it turns out they do. And in this dystopian realm and the social context, especially wartime, post-war, Cold War context of the society in which Wyndham was writing. I'm sure a lot of you I know, as I see your names, I know you, most of you, so I know you've read a lot of science fiction. So I would like to open this up and start giving you can start with a statement of what interested you in this meeting and in Wyndham, and then what is your question? So just raise your hands and we'll pick on you. I want to see some hands. You know how to raise your hand? That's where you go into reactions, and there's a button, raise hand. Otherwise, I'll keep filling, and that's boring, but I know how to fill. No pun intended, Phil. As you think about your questions, which may take a while, I'm going to make a question first to Phil, because I know he has a very parallel writer in Ray Bradbury. Neither one of them was fond of big cities. I noticed that. And when they escaped to not completely out in the wilderness. They don't go that far usually. They go to the countryside and the periphery of big cities. And that's sort of their locus of paradise, or escape place where they escape to. Now, I am a city person, and I tend to take a bit of a dim view of all this giving up on the cities and moving to your suburb. That was the big movement after World War II, when all this housing became available in the US. So are there counter indicators? I don't see any with Wyndham, but what about Bradbury?
Yeah, in Bradbury's fiction, I think he very much favors the small town. The exception, well, yeah, with Fahrenheit 451, of course, the original action takes place in a city, but as you say, the characters flee from the city at the earliest opportunity, and that's where they are regenerated and re-energized to the story's end, which basically has them turning around and going back, and that's where the story comes to an end. But most of Bradbury's other fiction, of course, is very much small town based. So Dandelion Wine, Something Wicked This Way Comes, almost anything else you care to name, even The Martian Chronicles has stories which are very much small town America, just transplanted to the planet Mars.
Question.
Yeah.
So may we say that this may contribute to the elimination of working class people who are clearly working class, because the city is where you see the biggest separation of employer and employee, especially working class, heavy industry employees. That's where you see them. They simply aren't out there where these people are writing about. So I would say place is an important factor in both of these two writers. And would you agree with that?
I would mostly agree with that. That the one complication with Bradbury is that almost every time he's writing in a nostalgic mode. So even though he may be writing about the present, he's really writing about his past. So the small town that he adores is the small town of his childhood, which almost certainly didn't exist in real life at that time. So I think Bradbury is complicated in that way.
Oh, yes. He's a nostalgic, looking backward through a tinted lens.
Absolutely.
And,
yeah.
I'm so pleased you addressed that question, because that has continuously interested me. And then when I came upon Wyndham, who's doing a similar number with avoiding cities and salvation is out of cities, I think that halfway answers your question, Patricia. Why are there no working class people? So if you look into the place where you see the clearest separation of big heavy industry and workers, where it's all together, is in the city, which they avoid. So I'm going to go to Bob now. I see Bob has a question. What did H.G. Wells think of Wyndham? Who wants to address that? It could be either of you. Do you know, Patricia, or maybe neither of you can address that? Maybe one of our audience can take that one on.
I can't help you.
No, I've never seen any indication that Wells ever said anything about Wyndham.
Yeah.
What we have to bear in mind is Wells, I mean, their lives overlapped, but Wyndham only really became this big novelist in the 1950s.
And Wells was dead.
Wells was dead.
The only way you can do it is, what did Wyndham think of Wells? We know that's documented in Amy Benson, I think.
Or if you had evidence that Wells read the American pulp science fiction magazines, because that was the only place really that you could read Wyndham pre-war, was in the American pulps, and they were very difficult to get in the UK. It's a miracle, in fact, that Wyndham ever found an American pulp,
and that was able to do with his being a big city boy, because he was in the city where they had these warehouses of trash magazines that they were going to use for some other purpose, stuffing things with pulp. I forget what they were going to destroy the magazines and use them for something. But this is the kind of activity you find in a large city with warehouses and pulping mills. So there's one indication that although he didn't credit what the city did for him, the city gave him access to those American pulp publications. So there you go.
I wonder, I think the relationship between Wells and Wyndham is a fascinating one, because they're both brilliant storytellers. They're both, if you like, fantastic imaginary and moral imaginary, producers. Both. Sometimes I wonder what it was that drew Wyndham to Wells, because Wells' politics is undeniable. They're unescapable in all of his fiction, not just the scientific romances. And it seems that Wyndham deliberately carved that out, that desire to totalize a particular society and to subject it to, sometimes quite tedious criticisms, in terms of speeches or addresses and so on. And the two novels, that I think of as being early dystopians, The Time Machine and When the Sleeper Wakes, they are again fantastic stories, but they're also saturated in, this really militant critique of the late 19th century, British society in particular, and also, kind of bubbles of utopian optimism about the possibility of technology. And for Wyndham, that just does not seem to have been of any interest whatsoever. He shrinks, I wouldn't call it a pastoral because it's not, but he shrinks his world. He shrinks it to something that seems to be more manageable. And then, like you say, Phil, he sets his very individuated character, typically the narrator, down, and lets him, that dynamic between survival and succumbing, lets that play out. So I'm curious as to why he would have not wanted to go bigger, if you like.
I was rereading Amy Binns's book this last week, and I think part of the clue may be in there. She talks about the time during World War II when the Soviet Union switched sides in the war. So first of all, they were part of the Axis powers. They had an agreement with the Nazis, but then they turned and became an ally of ours. And Wyndham, many of Wyndham's friends and his cohort of people he lived with and socialized with were very disturbed at this turn of events and were kind of confused by it, because it meant that the communist regime that was critical of the Western bourgeoisie was all of a sudden on the side of the governments that appeared to be the polar opposite of what they were interested in. So it put them in a very conflicted position. Amy Binns says that Wyndham was never interested in communism. He was never interested in anything that was dogmatic. He would class himself as a liberal. His life partner was a socialist, but not a communist. And so I think he'd arrived at a political place that for him was not particularly party political. It was certainly not communist. He wasn't even willing to call himself a socialist, but he was a liberal. So he sort of was staying away from anything that was too rigidly defined or dogmatic. And I think, therefore, that may be why his stories are not critical of anything that could be considered as being, party political or dogmatic in that sense. And I think what he found attractive about Wells's stories was the storytelling. It was precisely Wells's way of positing a situation and then exploring consequences. Wells may have set up those situations in order to make a political point, but that's not what Wyndham found interesting. It was, here's the what nowadays we might call the novum, the thing that causes the world to be different, and here's the exploration of the consequence of it. So I think Wyndham was interested in that, what he called the implicatory process, rather than the grander purpose that those stories could be used for. On the other hand, though, when he was reviewing science fiction in the 40s and 50s, he reviewed lots of books. He tended to speak positively of books which were dystopian or satirical, or that did have a bigger purpose. And I think he was doing that mainly to distance those works from the American pulps, which he considered to be trivial and somewhat childish. But yeah, he had a very a refined position but not one that he would allow to be sort of predefined, I think, by anybody else. At least that's the best explanation I can put forward.
Well, that's quite a thoughtful explanation, and it does explain how, though their politics were so different, Wells was the model for Wyndham. I can appreciate that. It's sort of like Verne was the model for Wells, even though Verne had not that big an interest in political systems. It was all more the tech and the novum for him, in the techno novum, I guess. I see we have a hand who's been a person who's been patient up there. Starlit Swan, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. I have, my perception of him is different. Wyndham.
Okay.
The thing is that you guys are talking about him, about the possibility of his stories being dystopian or not. But to me, my perception is that his stories are horror. And I feel that all the examples that you were given, Phil, to me, it feels like a reenactment of what he must have felt when he suffered the Blitz. It was something catastrophic that happened that nobody saw it coming.
Hmm.
Would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think all of these unforeseen things that happen in Wyndham stories are horrific. Sometimes they are, should we say, visceral in the horrificness. So, for example, the Triffids have these stingers, these things that lash out from the plant to attack people. So they are very visceral in the horror that they represent. Others, like the Midwich Cuckoos, is more of a, I suppose, a cerebral horror, coupled with a body horror when the penny drops as to what's actually happened. This forced raping of all the females in the village by this alien presence is more of a cerebral thing. And when you're told about it, you then have a kind of a visceral reaction as you think about, oh my God, what these women are now going through. But you're right. I think all of these are horrors. And I can only assume that the horrors of World War II were behind this. I mean, Wyndham, as well as living through the Blitz in London, he was part of the fire watch party that would try to protect the building that he lived in. Every night he'd be up on the roof looking for incendiary bombs and then trying to dispose of them. Which incidentally reminds me of, there's a wonderful short story by Connie Willis called Firewatch, which is a time travel story, but it's set during the Blitz. And it's about characters on the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral trying to prevent the incendiary bombs burning down into the cathedral. And Connie Willis's story is a very vivid story. And Wyndham's real life experience is very similar to what Connie Willis describes in her short story. So I agree. Horrors, absolutely. But horrors can be science fiction as well.
Oh, no, definitely. I do consider him very much science fiction. That is for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Starlight. Patricia, what do you think about Wyndham as a horror writer?
I think it's a lovely question because it brings up, the whole system of genres and how we use them. It's my understanding, now I don't know the biography of Wyndham, but that he wanted to be a science fiction writer. There's the experience, as you said, Phil, of the first half of his career, and then also that kind of spur when his brother started writing as well. So horror existed as a particular genre that he could have written to. But I think the genre conventions that he uses, they're the conventions of science fiction. Now, why should the border between them be hard and fast? I'm not so sure, because I think, the Krakens as well are they could be horror. They're slime, they're ooze, the little caterpillars or whatever it is that come out and fling themselves at people. And of course, then the triffids. You see the stingers, but also their little talky thingies, the three little legs that, they're perfect for a horror film. I think of something, the film The Thing. It's the early one, the original one from the 1970s. I always think of that as a horror, but it's a scientific expedition in the Arctic that unearths, a fossilized mammoth. What are the big animals? So I think it's a really interesting question, but I think it has to do with how we use genre classifications. And to my mind, I would be happy classifying Wyndham as a science fiction writer, but it brings up a bigger, if you like, more abstract question about the role of horror in science fiction. Think of a film as well, like Alien. Alien is horror, but it's science fiction. And I think of a lot of the contemporary or 21st century post-apocalyptic fictions as well. I know 28 Days Later was influenced by Wyndham, that opening scene set in London, an empty London. So I think there's a massive overlap, but not one we hold in our minds as we read, because, I do like horror. My father liked horror and it rubbed off on me a good deal. But I think of science fiction and horror as being quite separate. I'm just now wondering if that's a mistake.
I think it's very interesting that this shows how you can cut an apple one way or another way, the same apple, and it's not maybe an either or, it's a either or and both. And maybe in some writers, the both is a stronger thing than in others. And I hope you did look at my thing about the blinding gas in World War One, because when Wyndham was growing up, there were all these relics from World War One. Don't forget, he was born in 1903. So I think that even though it carried over much later, I think the fact of blind people leading blind people and blind people in columns, I'm sure that was a factor. So now I see Zora Janesi has her hand up. Zara, are you there?
Hi everyone.
There she is. Hello.
Hi. Okay. If you have my voice, shall I continue?
Yes, we hear you. You're coming in fine.
Okay. Thank you. I'm from Iran, and I'm so glad. This is my first time actually. I joined such meetings. I actually listened to both Patricia and Phil. Enjoyed their talk so much. Actually, my question is about if, for example, you're going to suggest some of the novels by Wyndham to be worked on by a student, for example, in PhD level or in MA level, if you're going to write a dissertation about that or a thesis, which one would you prefer and why? I ask this question because usually it's very risky when you want to guide a student toward doing a master's thesis or a PhD thesis or dissertation, I mean. The general outlook toward choosing these writers from the realm of science fiction is usually not that much positive. Even among my own students nowadays, I feel that they look at it as a low genre, science fiction in general, I mean. And it is sometimes difficult to convince them to choose these writers and their works and to somehow write a thesis or dissertation. So it takes time to convince them. It takes time to actually bring them to the real value of the genre, to somehow make them understand that this is really something important to do, and maybe a lot of new discoveries can be made if they read and do a dissertation or a thesis. But as I am going on, because I have been 13 years at University of Isfahan doing such a job as an academician, as academia, actually, I want to know, is it really valuable to do such a thing with regard to a dissertation or a thesis? What is your suggestion, both of you, Phil and Patricia? I would be very thankful for your answer beforehand.
Is it all right if I go?
Yes, please.
Hi, Zara. I feel like saying I'm just down the road from you. I'm in Muscat. I have an absolute echo of that sort of, it's not even a conscious disdain, it's just a kind of a blindness to any sort of literary value or even just intellectual history, understanding of science fiction. I think Britain, maybe not just Britain, but maybe Anglo-American studies were the same a few decades ago, but it has changed now. There's a lot of academic journals, there's a lot of academic publishing houses have a particular imprint, you know, for science fiction, so that you can introduce students, I think, to science fiction in a way that will make it, you know, in a way that you can sort of establish its prestige or credibility, whatever, however you want to think it. But I think there is another way, and that's to go with the stuff that the students like. And I know the Omani students here, they play a lot of video games, they watch a lot of dystopian television series. You know, they're very, very familiar with some of the tropes from, you know, Star Wars, Star Trek, you know, some of the classics. And I think it's to kind of introduce an older science fiction text alongside something like The Hunger Games, you know, something that they're familiar with from popular culture, and say, that novel, The Hunger Games, or series of novel, that has a history. And as part of that history, here is John Wyndham. And I think that's a way in sometimes. I'm trying to think the Wyndham I would go with. And I love The Day of the Triffids, but it's a bit broken backed, as in, not just because it's got the two stories, you know, it has the blindness, the blinding, and it has the Triffids. And the Triffids are clearly part of a Cold War bioengineering story. So I think I would probably go with the Kraken, When the Kraken Wakes, just because it's tighter, it's very tightly plotted, and it's very interesting in terms of, you know, specifically post-war English history, and how, if you like, people who had lived through the Second World War, people like Wyndham, you know, whose life kind of spanned from the beginning of the 20th century up until the post-war period. It's very interesting in technology, changes in gender, changes in attitudes, and it's got this rollicking good story in it as well. And it's maybe the most global. Phil can correct me here, you know, but it's got so many scenes and set in so many different places at a time when Britain's own empire was being taken away from it by, you know, the anti-colonial movements, that it's interesting in that sense. It's interesting politically as well. So I think I would nominate When the Kraken Wakes, and just really, really hope your students see the interest in it.
Okay, thank you, Patricia, very much. Of course, you know, I have already brought some of my students to this path of writing dissertations and theses, especially, for example, Margaret Atwood is a very interesting choice for most of them. And recently, one of them actually defended her thesis, and she wrote a very good one. Her article has been accepted by Canadian Literature Journal. So I think it's really valuable. But as for the rest of the writers, they are a bit, you know, skeptical whether they should spend time on this, they should spend energy on this or not. And as you say, if that is the person, the expert that talks about that suggestion, I would take it as valuable, and I would highly recommend my student to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think there's all sorts of issues around what a student chooses for their thesis topic, and one of them is inevitably the local circumstances of the university that they happen to be in. It shouldn't be this way, but some university departments will favor certain types of study, certain types of literature over others, and it's very difficult to break through those things. But if you happen to be in an institution that is open-minded or broad-minded, then I think it becomes easier. But I would second what Patricia basically said of having some kind of counterpart. So if it's something of Wyndham, then look for some counterpart in some other writer or some other medium. And I mean, Margaret Atwood would be an interesting pairing with Wyndham, because Atwood has spoken about Wyndham. She's spoken very favorably about the Midwich Cuckoos. Obviously, the Midwich Cuckoos is about forced motherhood, one of the themes of The Handmaid's Tale. So there's an obvious connection there. So I think those sort of connections can legitimize one author by hooking it to another author who already has some reputation as a valid literary study.
So, I got my answer. Thank you, Phil. Too.
Brilliant. Thank you, Zara.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just writing into the chat a novel. I have to admit, this is shameless of me, but I have written a murder mystery called The Blue Maroon Murders, set in a fictionalized University of Chicago, where the English department chair is a Moby Dick person, a Melville, I spelled it wrong, chair, trying to keep a faculty from having a science fiction class. And he starts off, not on my watch. Not on my watch will this man have his science fiction class. So if you're interested in a murder mystery that has that as a theme, there you go.
Hey, thank you. I'm gonna look for it, Gloria. I need to go, I'm afraid. I'm 8 hours ahead. Am I 8 hours or 10 hours ahead? I'm sorry, but it's just I have an exam in the morning. But before I do, I wonder, could I impose and just ask Phil, because I'm curious what you said. Is there still a kind of in UK universities, is there still a kind of a, plot or a pushing away of science fiction? Because I thought it had gone. I thought,
yeah, I think in the UK it has largely gone, yes. But I do still hear tales of American universities where there is some level of hostility, and also I've heard of institutions where a study of a single author is frowned upon, which to me is crazy. I think anything should go with a PhD. But I'm just aware that local conditions tend to be probably the most important thing in terms of what a student can and can't get away with.
It's I think especially for any contemporary student, because like you said at the very start of our talk, there have been so many dramatizations of Wyndham. It makes it perfect, even like for students studying adaptation or translation as well. Because I think I was introduced to Wyndham by Radio 4 dramatizations. It wasn't the printed page. It was when I had insomnia and couldn't fall asleep. But I'm going to leave you, everybody. But it was very, very nice to meet you, Phil. Gloria, thank you again, as always, and colleagues.
One sentence before you leave, please. Let me just get one more sentence in. Be sure to read Modern Fiction by Virginia Woolf. That is where science fiction was getaway's. Modern Fiction by Virginia Woolf. She had been a groupie of Henry James, and she didn't dare open her mouth until James and Wells had a falling out. And then she really took Wells on, and she made every one of the characteristics of Wells' writing a fault. So if you want the true origin of that ghetto, there it is.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Patricia.
Bye. Thank you.
Patricia,
nice to meet you.
Any other, we're having a good show of questions here, and I would love to hear any more. While you're musing on that, I want to say a few words about H.G. Wells and Henry James, because this is all very formative in the writing of Wyndham as well. He was watching this terrible feud go on between the modern fiction people that was represented by James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Conrad, and Henry James to some extent. And they were the highbrow. They were acceptable by the major publishers and H.G. Wells. So that went way back. And this was formative in the thinking of Wyndham. He saw that going on and he had to find his niche. Where would he fit in between the ones that Virginia Woolf had damned in modern fiction? Did he want to be one of those? And that was an important consideration because he lived in London and he was very much enveloped in the various class stratification. Everyone knew, they might not talk about it, they all knew where they were, and they wanted to be in with Bloomsbury more than the gutter snipe press, you know. So I see Starlet has her hand up again. So would you like to ask another question?
Yes. So I would like to ask a question and I would like to make a comment about what Sarah was talking about of introducing science fiction writers to to her students. One thing is also with H.G. Wells, for example, I find it really interesting that historically, in one of his novels that I don't remember the title of right now, I'm sorry, where he actually talks about the atom bomb before it was created. And it turns out that he figured out in the novel how to make it happen. And he wrote that novel as a way of saying, don't do this. Don't go down this path. And his novel was actually used in order to create the real atomic bomb and for us to go the path that he was saying, don't go this way. So that is another way of introducing science fiction in how an science fiction author, sometimes they can foresee something coming. So it's not just about criticizing society, but how can the future be made better or worse? So I wanted to make that point. And then the other thing that I wanted to to hear is, what do you think about going back to his writing of catastrophes? And I'm talking Wyndham. I know that he doesn't critique society, he doesn't bring in politics. But when you are writing something that is a catastrophe, politics has nothing to do with it. Because if you are living your own life and then out of the blue a bomb falls on you, whatever politics were being there in society has nothing to do with the catastrophe. It cannot prevent it from happening, it cannot foresee it or prepare for it. It's not about the class, because the bomb is going to fall and it's going to kill. It doesn't matter if it is whatever class you're in. And I wonder if maybe that was maybe one reason why he didn't do it that way, because in the Blitz, it didn't matter what the local politics may be. It didn't change the fact that the bombs were coming. And that was something unpredictable.
A great set of observations there. I think you're absolutely right about the nature of catastrophe. The one element, well, actually, there are two ways I think that politics could come into it. One is in the reactions to the catastrophe. So, for example, Wyndham could show what governments do in response to the Triffids invading.
Mhm.
But what he typically does is he doesn't allow us anywhere near governments because he keeps the focus on a set of characters who happen to be usually isolated from the rest of the world. So that's an authorial choice to not go there. But he could have chosen to show governments' reactions. The other way
Sure.
is what we would infer about the author. So Wyndham doesn't have to say anything about politics. We might still be able to infer that there is a political attitude to the work by the way he presents the story. And in Wells, for example, there are some Wells works which are very overt in their political critique. And there are others where the political critique is either hidden or kind of disguised as part of the narrative and is something that the curious reader will be able to tease out. So I think there could be a kind of an accidental or unconscious treatment of politics. I just think it is quite remarkable that very little of that comes out of Wyndham. And when people do start picking away at Wyndham for various things, it tends to be things not related to the catastrophe itself. The biggest criticism that was ever put against Wyndham, well, I don't know if this was this was in Wyndham's lifetime, I think, came from the British science fiction author and critic Brian Aldiss, who described Wyndham's works as cozy catastrophes. And he used that in a very scathing way. And it's because Wyndham's stories tend to be about middle-class, comfortable, affluent people rather than the working classes. But I think that really just comes from Wyndham writing about himself. He was thinking about how he would react, how his partner would react, how his friends would react. And if he happened to be affluent or slightly affluent, then, that's how the stories turn out. But that's a very good observation you have there. The thing about the atomic bomb, I think that was The World Set Free, was the H.G. Wells work.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And I think science fiction as prophecy is a big debating point. I think a lot of us think that's not an important role of science fiction, but it does often come up as being one of the values of science fiction, is that it has foreseen the future. I personally think that's missing the point of science fiction. I think science fiction is more about hypothesis. It's what if, and if this, then what? So to me, prophecy is not that important. It is extrapolation that's more important, but that's a personal thing.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Starlight. Thank you. At this point, I wonder if a thought popped into my mind earlier, and I didn't say it then, so I'm just going to say it now, even though it's not connected to that. The relationship between science fiction and horror. It occurs to me that it's been there from the beginning if you posit the first science fiction work, sort of modern-ish science fiction work, as being Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. That gave us science fiction as we currently have it. It also gave us horror as we currently have it. And most of the film adaptations of Frankenstein have been horror films, but the most recent one by Guillermo del Toro is very much a science fiction piece with horror. So yeah, I think science fiction and horror go hand in hand.
I think a lot has to do with the genres being created. If you read Franco Moretti's, what's it called? Trees, something and something. He's the one who uses big data and shows when genres came in and die by big data. And these genres didn't exist in her time. And it would be interesting to see. I think horror came in, well, of course, long before science fiction. So science fiction is obviously an offshoot of something that's non-real. not what they call nowadays literary fiction, meaning real life people in real life situations. So the first biggie was horror, and then the detective story, and only after Wells had already begun writing science fiction. It had different names too. It was scientific romance, then it was scientific fiction, and Bjornstad was coining different incarnations. So it's the most recent. And again, they're trying to do away with it with the new designation of speculative literature. And that is supposed to, I think, not in a very good way. I don't quite agree with it. Combine the elements and then fuzz the differences. And there's a reason that science fiction has a different genre than all the others. And perhaps because of the stain on the word science, because of the atomic bomb, people are moving more away from the word science. You could track that with Google Ngrams, the word science. What are the correlates? What are the adjectives used? Are they more positive? Over time, did the adjectives near the word science become more negative? And all of these are factors on and it may not even be at a conscious level when a writer like Ray Bradbury says, I don't want to be called a science fiction writer. He never wanted to be called a science fiction writer. So, but that's the new guy on the block is science fiction as a genre. But even horror was just coming in. I think, according to Franco Moretti's book, it was through the Gothic novels, Walpole and those people, the something of Otranto, I can't remember all the names. And that came in for the female readers who were very new. It used to be men who read, and then the huge growth of female readers came in, and with it, romance novels and horror Gothic novels. So that's kind of a Franco Moretti summary. If you want to read his book, I can look it up. It's something about trees and using that in the sense of graphs, trees, and something. I'll put it in the chat. Are there any other questions for the speakers? Well, one speaker who's left. More about his work. No one has asked any more about Phil's own work. He's a multifaceted person, and if you are interested in any of his work on Bradbury, or we don't have to stick in this topic that we've been in. Or just, why don't you chime in, folks? What are you involved in? And this is kind of open forum now. Introduce yourself and say, why are you here today and what's up? I see some people I know who might be interested in talking. Let's see, who's still here? Well, I know my husband Bob is still here. Bob, do you have anything you want to say as opposed to putting things in the chat? You want to thank the speaker or anything like that? Because I know he's working in some of your areas. Maybe Bob can't be heard. I don't know. He's in the other room on a different computer. So don't take that as a personal thing. Okay, we have a raised hand here. John Ryder, would you like to say something?
Yeah, since you were talking about H.G. Wells, I have a kind of a funny story because I used to write short stories and poems and stuff. And I was telling a friend, I used to go to these spoken word events, and I was telling somebody I was trying to do something sort of political and make a kind of allegory. And I said I wanted to tell a story called The Valley of the Blind, right? And he says, oh, H.G. Wells wrote a short story called Country of the Blind, right? And I had the hardest time finding it, but I finally found it in the rare books room at Columbia University where, they put it on a pedestal and they make you wear these white gloves and they have this little weighted sack to hold the pages down. You couldn't take it out. You could only read it there. And I liked this so much, I just didn't, I didn't want to write my story anymore because, I mean, his allegory wasn't, exactly the same. but it was all based on the idea, this medieval English saying, in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and the whole story is kind of like say, well, not necessarily, um, but I think Wells actually wrote probably almost as many books about socialism as he did about science fiction, which didn't have the same meaning back then. It wasn't, associated with Stalin, or it was associated with, the alternative to uh, rapacious greed. In the teens and 20s, during the Gilded Age, that was held up as, the right way to live. Be a manly, positive, brave person and think positive. Don't give in to weak, womanly, cowardly negativism. And all through, after Hoover was elected, for the next 3 years, he kept preaching that same gospel of positivism and saying, right, just around the bend is recovery. As long as we're all stick together and positive. And so anyhow, I think it's good that what did I read? Oh, I read something the other day that Thomas Huxley said, what did he say? Shoot, if I can find it. Oh, there it is. No, that's not it. Sorry. Oh man, I lost it. Oh, there it is. Thomas Huxley said, skepticism is the highest duty and blind faith the one unpardonable sin. So that's all I have to say.
Well, I think those are all very important thematic points and or societal points. And we're going into an era where science is guilty until proven innocent, and where unquestioned faith is innocent until proven guilty. So it's kind of a reversal of how it was until after World War II, where science was the trusted, and you still have people beating a dead horse, I would say, in English departments where they still yell about the unchallenged power of science. Well, I think we're well beyond that now. we're heading into a new loop where
Well, every spring, I send I post on social media and send to my friends this letter to the editor from Scientific American, I think from 2005, where they apologize. They say that they're apologizing about their position on climate change, and that, they're very ashamed of not giving equal time to Joe the plumber and allowing themselves to be swayed by mountains of evidence. And um, um, um,
and not
what was the
all
other thing?
the plumbers believe in that. I mean, there are working class people who are educated in science. That's one of
But
the
no, then
things
they go
that
on
I
to say, well, maybe we change our name from Scientific American to Scientific Un-American, or
no, it's
maybe we should change our
scientific,
name.
survey and marketing survey, and whatever the market follows, we will follow. I think it's truly a capitalist orientation where
No, but
now,
the end of the letter is, Happy April Fool's Day, everybody.
well, that's good.
Now, if
But
you can find this online. I can't remember what it's called. Um, we're so ashamed. It's Scientific American, I think it's 2005. Letters to the editor. I can't.
that's a
Maybe I
good
can find
joke.
it.
It's a very good joke, and a
Yeah.
lot of people
Well,
will.
I mean, it proves that, scientists can be funny. Arthur C. Clarke, I
Of
think, was
course they
hilarious.
can. Of
His
course they
what is
can. I think people in science fiction, that's a given.
what do they call it? Understatement. It's really very British. Arthur C. Clarke's very dry.
Well, if you find it, put it in the chat because we still have a few more minutes. And um, I think that is the problem where
Oh,
like
here it is. Here it is.
science. Okay,
Okay.
put it
If you
in the
want
chat,
to, oh, okay,
John.
put it in the chat.
John,
Okay, okay,
John, please
okay,
put it in the chat because it'll get
okay. I'll put
lost.
myself on.
But I think to go back to the overriding theme, it's that science itself has become the interrogated operating system, if you want to use computer technology, whereas blind faith is the ideal. And then when you start to challenge, you get out of the good guy category. And it used to be the other way, where people were forced to bend to the finding of science, even if they didn't understand the studies. And now it's you don't even ask because these are religious points, and either you believe it or you don't, and you're not good if you don't believe it. So we've moved, and that's a tremendous shift in the compass of people. At least I'm talking about the United States. I think in some of the other countries, science is still holding more credibility. When I read ResearchGate, that's a platform for people who are researchers, started at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and now it has a lot of humanities types on it. But when it started, it's just people that were very deep into hard science, and what they were posting up were papers. Well, now we have a lot of humanities people, and you can be an independent scholar. You just declare yourself that. You don't have to be from an institution. So among people who are coming in largely from the Mideast, Africa, and Asia, there is still more of a respect for science, at least in that platform, than I see in the United States. I want to thank you for that reference to this editorial that turned out to be an April Fool's, and I'm sure people will want to look it up. That's, again, that's an inference I'm making, but it's very hard to hold the line now and say that scientific evidence is a criterion that has credibility. It is such a circus here in the United States of other things being granted as much credence. Phil, you know what I'm talking about? You're the
Absolutely.
Speaker.
Oh,
I shouldn't hijack the floor
absolutely. Well, one of my personal things that I've always tried to do with my students is give them the question, how do we know this? So whatever it is we're talking about, whether we're talking about characters in a story, or if we're talking about something in the news or a scientific discovery, the question for me always is, how do we know this? Because knowledge doesn't just appear, it comes from evidence. We piece things together. So to give it a big name, epistemology. And I think this is what Wyndham and Wells are both very good at, especially early Wells stories and all of Wyndham. The stories are told by people who are witnesses to events. So everything in the story that we know because these characters have seen it or heard it. They've witnessed it with their own eyes and ears. And I think that's far more powerful than anything else.
So basic to Western thinking, and it comes out of Aristotle's rhetoric and his other texts. The episteme is, your basis of your case you're making. What is it based on? And then you have various ways, the pistes, to persuade different segments of society. And Aristotle has a whole categorization and list of, you use this argument for doctors, you use this argument for senators, and it was all formulated by Aristotle, and how you know it, you make how you know it different, the different kinds of evidence you'd use for the different groups within society.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what we've given over to in terms of my field of rhetoric, you have three things: logos, pathos, and ethos. Ethos is the character of the speaker, logos is your logic, and pathos is emotion. Well, it's all mostly ethos, the character of the speaker or the perceived character. So when someone like a president, I won't say of what country, says something, you don't need to go any farther. That's all his ethos. If his ethos is good, anything he says or she says is true. And then mixing that with a bit of pathos doesn't hurt either. But logos, where you have to prove something with types of evidence, how do you know this? They don't have to go through that, because if it's an ethos-based society, it's simply his ethos is perfect, and he may not be perfect, but we know him, and anything he says goes. Mm-hmm. So this is a problem for science fiction, because it's based on the opposite, where we use inductive logic in the world that we see and can sensorially experience, until we get to some stage where we can make a generalization called a hypothesis. And none of that is going on today. None of it. Everything starts with blind faith in a leader or in a dogma. And from there we move.
Do you think we can extrapolate from that and say maybe that's why fantasy fiction is seemingly dominating the bookshelves just lately?
Yeah, I've noticed this over 20 years, since way back when I was a late starter getting my PhD. But I was going to do some kind of a thing on science fiction fandom and which segments are booming and which segments, using surveys at conventions to break it down, into the subgroups. And I was also going to bring in the bookshelves at the bookstores, or nowadays online. And you can go actually to somewhere like Amazon and do the sub section. You do a search for science fiction, see how many hits you get, and then do a search for fantasy, and you can do comparisons, or use Google's Ngram server and then use the word fantasy fiction, the phrase, and see what the trend is. It gives sort of a chart trend, a timeline chart where it goes up X, Y. You have a line you follow, timeline. And you'll see fantasy is going up, up, up. And science fiction is maybe increasing a little. I'd have to do a new one and see. So this is part of, because also the money given to public schools has gone down. Many private schools don't emphasize science. That's not what they're about. But the public schools do, and yet they have less and less money for the supplies, the books, the labs. And so scientific science education, which was booming during the rivalry between, the big blocks in the 50s, is now tanking. So if you have science literacy going way down, then people who will even look at a book that has that designation or try to write it. And that's one reason why we founded this group, Phil, is to bring in scientists and to convince people that they can write science fiction. They don't have to have a PhD in physics or astronomy or psychology, psychiatry. We have these people, we'll have them come and talk, and many of them will say, if you're writing a plot and you have this incident in my field and you want to have a human story around it, just come to me. Show me your script. Show me your text, and I will help you. You don't have to have the PhD. Many of these people at colleges are happy to be approached by writers, and I don't think people know that. So you yourself don't have to be a PhD. You can still write science fiction and just get a good collaborator who is a PhD. That's why we're here, in fact. That's why this group exists, one of the reasons. It grew out of the Tucson Festival of Books, to tell you the truth, and we had panels in person there by what we called scientists who write science fiction. And those kind of died out because I got tired of fighting the huge crowds and everything. They got okay attendance. And then I thought, I did survey there and I had people sign up and give once we had online, I said, would you like to have an online? First, it was a list, where they could exchange email views. And then once we had Zoom, we used to meet in person, our science fiction group, and now we meet here with the same goal, to keep science fiction from dwindling away in favor of these other booming genres. I don't know if I ever told you that, Bill, but that's the origin story of this group. And I don't think there's another like it.
No, I'm not aware of any others, no. I've just seen a comment in the chat from Starlit.
I know we're doing a revisionary look at the Dark Ages, and I think I know where this is coming from. And yes, there are things that were good that came out of it, like the medieval period where the Arabic astronomers were still preserving science. And there are a lot of gross oversimplifications of the so-called Dark Ages, and we're beyond that. So yeah, I agree with you. Imad, I'm not familiar with that novel. What is it? Are you able to speak?
I'll look up the name of the author. I keep forgetting his name.
And what is it like? You said it's like something. What comparison are you making there?
Yeah, in this story, it's by Clifford D. Simak, a novel. You have a future world where they don't have astronauts anymore. They can't they can't conquer space because of radiation, cosmic radiation, and the radiation belts around Earth. But they have these telepaths who can contact alien races and bring back technology and everything. And even though this has improved the standard of living, it's led to a new dark age. The reason is the technology is so advanced, it seems like magic. And also these telepaths, they're the new heroes of this age. And again, it's what they do is like magic and things like that. Astronauts were technically scientists. They were the original heroes. So you get people going back into a dark age and believing in werewolves and doing witch hunting and these kind of things.
Yeah, I think it's not like an either or, and I think that's good that we have stories challenging that the Dark Ages, so-called, had a lot of the origins of technology and invention. I mean, they interpenetrate. You know, there are really things that never were credited correctly in the Dark Ages or medieval times. And that was because the Enlightenment was trying to set itself off in terms of categories as a whole new and different thing, which it wasn't. You know, I mean, astrology got siphoned off and led to astronomy in terms of categorizations. So, you know, just categorizing a big, huge swath of time as being all dark is too valued thinking, and that's always overly simplified. You know, you can't say this Enlightenment scientific era is all good. Of course not. We don't do that anymore. And you can't say that was all bad or backward. Of course not. We know a lot now about the herbalists, the witches, the people who were doing many very innovative things that were taken up and never credited to them by later people who had the credential of being a professor of something. And in fact, I don't know, you know, I could run on about that, but I think just those two categories are very bad, and it's part of the reason why we're where we're at, where now science is being dumped into the trash bin of history and everything else is being venerated without challenge, and that's what's worrisome. All you have to do is hang a shingle out that you're adjusting people's light auras, and nobody questions it, you know. And you can call it the quantum light aura adjustment consulting firm. No one will challenge it, and that's where we are when you have no way to know how do we know what we know. Everything should be challenged. You want to know each one of those words. Where does that come from? How does that relate to what you're doing? And if we get back to that, whether we're challenging science or the anything but science types of explanations for things, then we're true skeptics, and we can leave being a skeptic. We don't have to remain skeptics, but we have to start with some skepticism. Otherwise, it will be a few people leading us all. And we already see that. We see some of that. And when you have no way to judge, it's these people who control the big social media. Millions of people follow them on social media. And that's because, as I said earlier, they're ethos-based. It's the character of the speaker. No need to question or look for evidence. And that's coming not out of science, but out of the field of rhetoric. And I think that it's a very challenging time for many people who don't want to see just a few people followed without anyone asking evidence of what they're putting forth. Anybody else? Now, I guess people are starting to run out of steam here, but I appreciate that you came, Phil, and I think this was a wonderful introduction to a much underrated and lesser known writer in the United States. And I understand this is, again, an example, isn't it, of how different we are, but we don't realize it. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the whole of British science fiction has its own evolutionary path, which Wyndham himself speaks of the sort of the Verne and Wells tradition as sort of going one way, and then there's the American thing sort of coming in from somewhere else almost. The fact that they're considered in any way intersecting is sort of almost accidental, but it's really through the pulp magazines, isn't it? Through Gernsback and Amazing Stories.
Could I say one thing for Isaac Asimov?
Yeah.
When you bring the American thing, that's disallowing people like Isaac Asimov, who did follow, I think, more or less the Wells more British model in their writing. And they did have
Yeah.
black boxes too, but so did Wells. But I mean, I think I would say he wasn't so much a pulp fiction guy. He was someone who got published in the pulps occasionally, but they had to bend to him. He didn't always bend to them, as in the best short story almost ever, Nightfall. And that's in the tradition of Wells, where you take something and you challenge it and you want to know what is night. And so some of the American writers, there were two branches. There were those who did use the kind of Wellesian approach, but I think it was hard for Wyndham to factor that in, or it would not make his category as clear. He couldn't say, oh, except for Isaac Asimov and these others.
Yeah, and of course Wyndham was doing most of his writing about science fiction in the 1950s. So really, in the early years of what we would call modern science fiction.
Right.
So most of his experience would have been in the pre-war pulp magazines, which was even before John W. Campbell came along, really.
That's right. And it was Campbell who was, what do you call it, mentoring people like Asimov and would bring in stories by Arthur C. Clarke. And so they were fostering that kind. Yeah, it's a very interesting field, but we didn't know. I mean, I didn't know a thing about Wyndham actually writing. It isn't manifestos. That isn't the word I'm looking for, but programs, I guess, for where he thought British science fiction should go, because he saw the pitfalls that American SF had fallen into, with endless bad things being made into endless sequels of things that had not a brain about them, but the same tropes, the ray guns, the women with the overstuffed bras, over and over and over. And he didn't want that. And I guess he knew there were enough readers, didn't he, in the UK, who would actually support that, his stuff.
He did. He was tangentially involved with early British fanzines. He was involved in the first World Science Fiction Convention that was held in the UK in the 50s. He was on the committee of that, and he attended that convention. And he was sort of like the leading British spokesman for science fiction through the late 50s into the 60s.
And wasn't that a tremendous sacrifice for him to be on the committee? From what I've been reading, he was a recluse. He really hated interviews. He hated it.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical about that when people say that he was reclusive. I don't think he was reclusive. I think he just didn't like the media.
Okay, so that one interview he gave didn't indicate his personality, more his disdain for the media.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
And in fact, I'm trying to remember which book it is. I think it's Trouble with Lichen or Trouble with Lichen, depending on how you choose to pronounce that word. I think that one has got lots of invented newspaper stories that he sort of intersperses in the narrative, and they're all quite sarcastic and stylistically designed to reflect the style of particular news outlets.
So he was perhaps having a satiric take on the media, then making them crude and not really on top of things. I'll have to read that, because I can include that somehow in my review writing. That's a good distinction, because I've seen mention of his being reclusive, I think, in both these books, and I may want to make that more nuanced.
Yeah, I mean, I think in everyday life, I don't think he was reclusive. He might have been a bit shy about public speaking, but it was mainly a disdain for the media that he had.
And I see Starlit Swan is telling us about the three-body problem, and I can't ever say his name can you say his name, the Chinese writer of the three-body problem?
Cixin Liu?
Yeah, Cixin Liu. Terrible butchering. But it's very hard to get through. I have it. I have a copy of it, and I've read half of it, I think. But you do get into the story part, but it's one of those that's very much science and science fiction, but also revolutionary Chinese horrors going on, the Cultural Revolution, and all kinds of political background as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Starlit Swan. That's a good example. And many people have lost the ability to have a long attention span. I don't know. I'm studying that as well in oh, where are we getting, the kinds of things, the kinds of activities that people are doing are now being studied in terms of very short blips on Instagram. And if you do nothing but that, they are starting to find, and this may be challenged, that it thins the gray matter. It actually makes a structural change to the brain. You all know that? If you do nothing but very short, where you don't have to be active, but you're being bathed in a cascade of these short blips, and you are doing something like reading them, but no active construction of anything lengthy following a process. That ability isn't always there to draw upon, apparently. It starts to thin out the gray matter that allow for lengthy process thinking or drafting a long paper and writing a long paper or novel. People
This is
can't do
one
it.
of the things that Ray Bradbury warned us against in Fahrenheit 451.
I know,
The
and they wouldn't read
trivialization
it.
of text.
They wouldn't read it in my book group.
Oh,
They said, "Oh, we had to read that in school."
Yeah.
Yeah, should reread it now. But the shoulds and oh, we know you were a teacher. So anyway, you do what you can do, and yeah, I think that these are important. It's the balance. Here's what Virginia Woolf held against H.G. Wells. She said, "But your characters have no rich inner lives, do they?" He had to. She said, and she gives a paragraph where he summed up a whole garden party in a paragraph. Now, in my novels, that would take 20 pages, where we would go into every nuance of a lifted cup or a raised eyebrow and what that meant to the characters. Whereas you summarize the whole thing in one short paragraph. How can that be fiction? Am I doing a good job here? But that's where summarizing is a value in journalism. And Wells, she said, had a journalistic style, which was not the goal of modern fiction. The goal was to develop the way the mind really works, our rich inner lives, and let them blossom, for pages and pages of interior monologue, for instance. So science fiction has gotten into some of that, and it no longer disdains that. But I think that was the original objective versus subjective. What that really boils down to is subjective is all, says Virginia Woolf. H.G. Wells, objective is all, the objective world.
And I mean, Wells could be seen as being an innovator in that because he anticipates cinema. The style of Wellesian storytelling is the style of cinema that you can only observe. You can't go into somebody's head in a film. Well, you can with modern sound films, but certainly in silent film, it's almost impossible to get directly inside somebody's head, except in a sort of a surrealist presentation.
Right.
So Wells really is prefiguring cinema in the way that he writes.
Yeah, you're right. Someone even said that the time travel where it flickers, it was like those early movies.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, but I think that's so important that this is the balance between the two. And that's where any writer has to figure out, where am I between objective and it. Now, of course, postmodernism challenges that there may be no objective, but that's part of the big broad brush attack on science. So, one of the aspects of the attack is that there is nothing but subjectivity. There is no objective. And that will certainly affect your fiction style, where you fall on that kind of a scale.
But even that can be addressed by a sort of a mixture of styles. You can have, for example, you could have a novel where each chapter is told from the point of view of a different character, told through their eyes and through their experience. So at the sentence level, we may have the subjectivity, but at the level of the book, we can have something that approaches more of a consensus reality or a kind of a shared reality, even if the individual testimonies contradict each other. And to me, that's fine. So you can be both postmodern and traditional. That's
the Rashomon
exactly that.
effect. Or Karl Čapek, he wrote a novel called Meteor, where it was the same thing in the 1920s, I think. But so this is how you can address that problem. But I think I think it's this big worldview problem. People who are in the worldview that there is nothing but subjectivity, they won't even get it. They'll just see these as a bunch of individual people and they're all subjective. They won't get that there is the possibility of a more accumulative parallax views of various individuals leading to a greater accuracy of what's out there. They don't even understand that concept anymore. It's all just this one says,
Yes.
and then this one says.
But that reminds me that that's a very old way of constructing novels anyway, isn't it? Because you would have the epistolary novel, which is made up largely of individual testimonies and letters and diaries from different characters, and constructing a sort of a story that is bigger than any one of those characters.
And of course, one of the biggest ones is Dracula. It's just epistolatory novel.
Yes.
I got that right. And but at the end, there is the scientific kind of accumulation of evidence that yes, this being exists in Carfax Abbey. Yes, from the behaviors, these people have died, that has happened. Therefore, we go and we drive the stake in the being who is doing these things. So there was an accumulative adding up of all the parallax views of Harker and Van Helsing and this one and Mina and all of them. And that is the more scientific outlook. But where you're just, this one says and this one says they're all equal and there's nothing bigger, it's what we would say in culture studies, it's a differend, then it's never resolvable. And that's why things seem to be going round and around in circles, because it's never resolvable if they're all just voices and there's no parallax views give them more, if only if you use them additively and you have standards for the evidence of some kind of what's going on. So yeah, and so Virginia Woolf put down that she was a total adherent of total subjectivity, and she resented it. I looked in she went to Cambridge, I think, rather than Oxford. I'm not sure, but I think she went to Cambridge, but maybe Oxford. But I looked in the index and there were no science words at all in her whole biography. I don't think anybody ever did that before, but I did that. And I looked and it was like, she was there when Fleming was discovering, antibiotics. Fleming, he was making these tremendous breakthroughs. There were no science words in her index of her biography. But there are other biographies that I just searched one, but it was one of the main ones. And apparently she didn't have any interest in being married to an astronomer and being a PhD in English and in literature and rhetoric. I have made a career of crossings where people often really dislike the other field. They do, either way. Mostly the science people are oblivious to what literature people say about them, but they're surprised, not too happy when they hear some of the things. So it is golf. It is the two worlds that C.P. Snow, a British writer, not one of ours, one of yours, he pegged it, didn't he? The two worlds or two cultures, which I don't know. Can you speak to C.P. Snow?
Probably not as well as you can, frankly. But yeah, I mean, it was his view that science and arts, or arts and humanities, and never the twain shall meet. But I think there's been a lot of response to that in terms of, well, if that is how the world is, let's try to make it other than that. And certainly, I mean,
didn't he say that many world problems can't be solved because they're so separate and they can't communicate? I think that was the end part of what he said.
Yeah, but I think there was a movement to try and fix that as a response to what Snow said. When I was originally a student back in the 1980s, I was a science student, but the university I went to had a very strict policy that every science student had to do at least one course, one unit, one module in an arts subject, and vice versa. All art students had to do at least one course in science. And that was a recognition that there was a huge gulf between the two, and it was an attempt to allow some complementarity in there. I mean, I don't know how widespread or how effective that was.
Oh, it's still
Um,
going, and it's very much
mm.
enforced in the United States.
Oh,
You
right.
don't take
Okay.
just one, you have to take 2 semesters of
Ah,
basic composition, English. You have to have
mm.
2. Any science major has to do that.
Oh, that's
And
good.
one of those
Yeah.
semesters is lit, the other one is rhetoric comp, you know.
Mm. Mm.
So this is the borderlands that we exist in these science fiction meetings. We have a lot of people who are not specifically science fiction. We do have fantasy people coming and speaking, but mostly we tend toward that.
Yeah.
And art. So thank you once again. And it looks like we're down to the wire. We've really touched on very important topics, each of which could possibly be a separate meeting. So thanks to both of you, Patricia, who had to leave, and you who are still here, Phil, and hope to see you soon. And thank you all for coming. Have a very happy 2026. I hope it's prosperous and healthy for everyone. And take good care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.